Well, this was a pretty crazy one. The Squirrel Squadron was well known for having like 7 or more airplanes taken off as a flight. And we had a 200-mile-an-hour airplane flying with a 60-mile-an-hour airplane. So needless to say, we couldn't really keep a tight formation doing something like that. And every time we'd get back to a control tower airport like Albert Wooded was at the time, they would basically say, if you guys are going to be a flight, you got to stay within 2 miles of each other. But, you know, we used to get yelled at Lakeland and everywhere else we went, but no one really cared. One guy in the flight, he used to always like to, instead of taxiing to the turnoffs, the actual taxiways, he would cut across the grass, and the tower would yell at him every time for, don't run over the runway lights. You know? But he just did it every time. I think he'd like to have the tower yell at him. But this one time, we had like a flight of 7, and Breezy, the Quickie, all kinds of different airplanes. But Art Wonderly, he flew a Scamp. It was a biplane Scamp with a Volkswagen engine, very little airplane, 1-seat airplane. But he was well known for flying off and disappearing. He'd find something over there, and he'd go fly over and look at it, and he'd leave the group. So we never really knew where he was. Like I said, we all had radios, so we could talk to each other, but he would just disappear on us. So one time we're coming back from, I think it was Lakeland or something, and we're crossing Tampa Bay, going back to Albert Wood, and Art, we didn't hear anything from Art, but you know, we figured he's just following us and he's okay. Turns out as Art was crossing Tampa Bay, he was having engine problems. He was losing power, and he was going down and down and down. But he figured he could make it to Whitted. But when he was at about 10 feet up, he's like, well, he couldn't hold altitude. He couldn't get enough power, and the plane was just sinking and sinking. So splash! It went into Tampa Bay, and it turned upside down. So now Art's head is in the water, facing down. And he unfortunately had one of those push-button seat belts. And I don't know if you guys know it, but if there's pressure against those seat belts, you can't get that belt open. So he's pressing and pressing, trying to get the belt open, and he's running out of breath. But he said the plane popped back up, and he was able to get a gulp of air and get the seatbelt released before it went down again. And so he was able to get out of the airplane sank in Tampa Bay. I think it was just like maybe the tail was still sticking out or something. It wasn't very deep. And turns out the Coast Guard boat came up and picked him up, so in Tampa Bay. And the Coast Guard puttered him back to the Coast Guard Air Base that was at Albert Wooded. And their commissary there has food, hot dogs, hamburgers, all this kind of stuff. So Art took it upon himself to get himself a hamburger and a drink, and he wanders from the Coast Guard Air Base down into the George's hangar. And so we're all back there hangar flying and thinking, whoa, what the heck happened to Art? I don't know. We're mad at him because he took off and didn't tell anybody again. We figured he was some other airport or doing something, because that was just the way he was. But then he walks around the hangar door, and we're staring at him, and he's soaking wet, he's dripping on the floor, and he's eating a hamburger, and we're like, what the heck? But then we hear the whole story, how he lost power, plunked it into Tampa Bay. So a bunch of the Squirrel Squadron guys got a few boats together and stuff, and went out there and pulled his Scamp out of the Tampa Bay. And Art lived pretty close to a lake, a freshwater lake. So they took the plane and they just threw it in that lake there near Art's house. And I don't think that airplane ever flew again. That was his idea was to rebuild it and get it back in the air, but it never did, from what I can remember or find. I had back then, Gary, Reed, and George flew up north somewhere and brought home a Vollmer VJ-22 Sportsman, a seaplane. It was actually a boat hull, so call it a flying boat would be more appropriate. But they got back with that, and then they played with it for quite a while. And finally, I I don't know, George wanted to sell his share of it, so I bought out George's share. So I was owning it with Gary, and so we had some fun with that seaplane. Had some, you know, landed in the saltwater mostly, which is really hard on seaplanes. But young Bruce and I figured Bruce wanted to go for a ride, so I picked up Bruce, and you know, this seaplane, I knew I could get out of the water with just me, or maybe a big fish if I'm lucky. So I told Bruce about it. I was like, hey, you know, might have a hard time getting you out of the water, particularly if there's waves, because you're taking off and you hit this wave and it slows you way down. Then you gather speed, and you hit another wave and it slows you down. So we flew down to like the foot of the Skyway Bridge and landed in the water with this seaplane. But man, I could not get that thing out of the water. I was just like, trying, and it just won't come out of the water. And so basically I left Bruce on the foot of the Skyway Bridge and flew back to Albert Whitted. I got a lot of grief from Bruce from the rest of the years out of that one. But we did go down there and pick him up with a car. But anyway, I left Bruce on the bridge there that day. Another day I was flying the seaplane back, and the tail wheel had gotten, you know, it wasn't in great shape. It was a little rusty, and the middle of the runway has these little bumper lights. So if you hit that with your tail wheel, it feels like you run over a 2x4. So I came in that day and I hit one of those bumpers with the tail wheel, and it snapped right off. And so that's my steering and everything back there. So I'm like, how am I going to get back to the hangar with this thing? But at air shows, I'd seen other tail draggers power up and then hold forward sticks so that the tail comes up. And then basically you use the brakes to steer you around and stuff. So I managed to taxi all the way back to the hangar with my tail up like that. And I remember when we got back to the hangar, the brakes were just smoking hot, because the tail on that airplane was really heavy, so I had to use a fairly good amount of power, and then I had to use the brakes to keep the airplane slow enough. But I got back to the hangar with that Balmer VJ-22. Years later, after a lot more salt water, a guy from the Atlanta, Georgia area flew down, and he bought the airplane from me, and so we ferried that up to Georgia. Our deal was that anything breaks on the way, I pay for. So we got all the way up to the Atlanta, Georgia area, landed successfully, everything was great, and the alternator had quit though. You know, didn't really need a lot of power for things, but so all I had to do was get him a working alternator and get on that thing. So it did really well. It got to Atlanta quite well. Also, Tom had a Waco at Albert Whitted, and he was out flying doing something, but he came in to land at Albert Whitted, and the wind just caught him and tipped a wing into the ground, and over he went. Basically, I think he went upside down basically with the plane, and it was a pretty bad crash. So unfortunately, Tom had lost an eye due to that crash too. So it was pretty serious. But all the Squirrel Squadron guys got out there. You know, the plane wasn't upside down, because the Squirrel Squadron guys went out there and picked up all the plane mess and dragged it back to Tom's hangar and locked it away in the hangar. And then the press all arrived, and the FAA arrived, and they were all asking questions about this airplane crash, and where's the airplane, and all this stuff about it. And every one of the squirrels, everybody that was down at the airport was like, what crash? What are you talking about? I don't know anything about a crash. They were all lying really badly. But basically it never made the news, it never made any attention, because there was nothing to investigate. Maybe not the best thing to do, but in this case, you know, these tail draggers are kind of easy to tip over like that, easy to crash. And, but yeah, we kind of covered that one up.